In July of 2010, Elliot Warren and Marissa Dale were the kind of couple people envied. Both 27, both recent college grads, both fiercely outdoorsy in that quiet, determined way. Elliot worked in environmental research. Marissa was training to be a wilderness therapist. They weren't careless kids. They planned their hikes the way someone might plan a cross-country move, painstakingly, down to the gear weight, food rations, and weather contingency. When they told their families they were heading to the Glacier Trail in Montana's Beartooth Mountains for a weekend loop hike, no one worried. It was a trail they'd done before, in sections. This time, they just wanted to try the full loop, 3 days in and out, back by Sunday night. They left Friday morning from a trailhead near Cook City. Elliot texted his sister one last time just before losing reception. "Starting the trail now. The weather looks perfect. Back soon." That was the last time anyone heard from them. When Monday rolled around and neither of them showed up for work or responded to texts, Marissa's mom called the ranger station. Within 2 hours, a standard overdue hiker report was filed. Within 4, a search and rescue team was deployed. What nobody realized then, what would haunt people later, was how little they'd have to work with. The search began like every other missing hiker case. Officials pulled the hiking permit, mapped the expected route, and dispatched a helicopter for aerial scanning. Foot teams canvassed the most likely campsites. But by day 2, worry turned to confusion. There were no tents found, no cooking fires, no discarded wrappers, no prints leading off trail. It was like Elliot and Marissa had stepped off the face of the earth within the first mile and taken every trace of themselves with them. Their car was still parked neatly at the trailhead, locked, nothing disturbed. Inside was a small folder labeled Trip Plan, maps with handwritten notations, dates, and food supply checklists. The first mile of the trail showed only faint boot prints that quickly faded near a rocky incline. That stretch was heavily trafficked and not unusual for prints to be lost among hard stone. But the complete absence of any personal items, no scarf snagged on a branch, no footprints near stream crossings, no improvised campsites, sent up red flags for veteran rangers. Helicopters combed the area again. Trained dogs were flown in from Helena. But they found nothing. No scent trail, no clothing, no sign of struggle or injury. Elliot's father, Don Warren, who had hiked the region in his youth, arrived by the 3rd day and personally walked the trail with rangers. He said later in an interview, "It didn't feel like they got lost. It felt like they were never there." Local weather reports confirmed that skies had remained clear through the weekend. No lightning storms, no flash floods. Daytime temperatures stayed in the high 60s, nighttime dropped to the low 40s, cold but survivable with gear. Both Elliot and Marissa were carrying 60-liter packs, rainproof, fully stocked. At least that's what they'd packed when they left. Rangers scoured side trails, creek beds, and even the edges of glacial runoff zones. Still nothing. By day 5, the incident was reclassified as a deep field disappearance. That term, rarely used publicly, essentially meant search teams were out of leads. It wasn't just that the couple couldn't be found, it was that no trail existed to suggest where they might have gone. On day 6, a private team of volunteers joined the effort, many of them recruited through online forums. Among them were 2 men who specialized in satellite imaging and another who had trained as a forensic tracker. They began at the same spot as the rangers, but even with fresh eyes and new tech, they found nothing. Not even broken vegetation, no signs of distress or deviation. People began whispering theories. Some said maybe they'd staged their own disappearance, but that didn't match their behavior. There were no large cash withdrawals, no goodbye notes, no signs of marital stress. Others suggested animal attack, but that didn't hold up either. Grizzlies leave signs, blood, torn packs, drag marks. There was none of that. Some even floated the idea of a crime, but there were no persons of interest, no motive, no evidence. Just a missing couple and silence. By the end of the first week, the official search was scaled down. The families remained, hoping for a miracle. But deep down, they knew this wasn't a typical lost hiker case. Something didn't add up. And over the next 15 years, that sense would only deepen as time, seasons, and snowfall buried whatever truth was left behind. By the second day of the search, everything shifted. What started as a methodical operation turned into a race against time as a surprise snowstorm rolled across the higher elevations, dropping visibility to near zero and burying the trail under 6 inches of wet snow. For a region known to surprise even seasoned hikers, the sudden change in weather wasn't unprecedented, but the timing couldn't have been worse. Helicopters were grounded, thermal drones were rendered useless, and whatever tracks Elliot and Marissa might have left behind in their first day on the trail were gone, sealed under fresh snowfall that blurred every sign of movement. Still, rangers were adamant that the storm came late enough. The couple would have had hours of fair weather, enough time to set up camp, enough time to find shelter. But none was ever found. On the third day, when skies cleared briefly, a new clue surfaced, a digital ping. Search techs had pulled metadata from Elliot's last known photo, sent to his sister that Friday morning. The image had been geotagged near Ridgepoint Summit, roughly 11 miles from the trailhead. It was a common place to rest, a rocky overlook with wide glacier views and a side path that looped back down through a narrow valley. From that point forward, the terrain became more technical, but still manageable. Rangers recalibrated the search zone, focusing efforts around the summit and the surrounding ridgelines. But even then, there was no trace. No shelter site, no gear, not a single piece of fabric or food wrapper. It was as if their presence ended with the photo. On day 4, a grid team swept the valley below Ridgepoint. One ranger noted disturbed pine needles along a slope, consistent with foot traffic, but the trail ended abruptly at a rock face. No scratches, no boot drag, no sign of a fall. Another team, sweeping to the east, came across a cluster of balanced stones, possibly a marker, but when compared with older satellite images, the formation had been there for years. At base camp, maps were laid out and re-examined. Some theorized the couple may have attempted to bushwhack toward an old fire road, either to shorten the loop or explore off-trail. But this went against everything their families knew about them. Elliot and Marissa weren't impulsive hikers. They followed routes, logged elevation changes, and double-checked their GPS. The snow melted fast under the summer sun, revealing only more silence. The dogs brought in earlier lost interest quickly. Without a solid scent trail, their work became guesswork. A scent article from Marissa's pillow was used again at higher elevation, but the dogs veered in opposite directions, eventually sitting down in confusion. On day 6, a brief spark of hope emerged when a ground team spotted something blue, half buried near a cluster of boulders. It turned out to be an old tarp, weathered and torn, likely abandoned years earlier. Not theirs. Not relevant. Park officials began to grow cautious with the public. At a press conference, a spokesperson assured the media that all high-probability areas were being searched and that survival chances, while decreasing, were still plausible. But among the searchers, the mood had shifted. The consensus wasn't just that Elliot and Marissa were missing. It was that they'd left no trail at all. And that's what bothered everyone the most. Even when hikers get lost, even when weather turns deadly, the wilderness always leaves clues. Footprints in mud, torn branches, a dropped knife. But 8 days in, 30 square miles covered, and there was nothing. No signs of a slide, no clothing snagged on trees, no indication they had ever camped. That detail, the absence of anything, kept coming up in search team debriefs. Rescuers who had worked dozens of lost hiker cases called it off. One ranger, who had been with the service for over 20 years, later said that it didn't feel like an accident. It was like chasing shadows, he told a regional news outlet. Like we weren't looking for people who got lost, we were looking for people who vanished. By the end of the 8th day, fatigue began to show. Volunteers were rotated out. Helicopters resumed flyovers, but covered nothing new. Command moved their central base back to the ranger station, leaving a skeleton team behind. The family stayed. Elliot's dad spent long hours walking the lower creek beds, retracing miles already searched. Marissa's mother kept a notebook of every ranger she spoke to, every square marked on the map, as if the right question might open a door they'd all missed. The investigation didn't end, not officially, but momentum did. Rangers marked the case as inactive with no evidence of foul play. Forensics hadn't been deployed because no crime scene had been found. It was a disappearance without an event. And in those final days of the search, as the mountains returned to stillness and snowmelt fed the rivers again, what echoed most was not just the couple's silence, but the wilderness's refusal to give up a single clue. On the 9th day of the search, as the official operation quietly began to wind down, park investigators shifted their focus to something else: interviews. Over 60 hikers had signed trailhead logs during the weekend. Elliot and Marissa vanished. Some had taken nearby routes, others had completed the full glacier loop. Most remembered nothing out of the ordinary. A few claimed they'd seen a young couple matching their description, some near Ridgepoint, others much farther south, but timelines didn't quite line up. The sightings were vague. One man said he saw someone with reddish hair near a stream bed on Saturday afternoon. Another remembered hearing laughter echoing through a canyon, but couldn't say when or from what direction. None of it was definitive. Then came a report from a solo hiker named Brent Holloway, who had spent Saturday night near Upper Pine Lake, a remote spur trail about 5 miles northeast of the main glacier route. He told rangers that around 3 a.m. he was awoken by what sounded like a woman screaming. Not once, but twice. He hadn't left his tent, just stayed frozen, listening. The next morning, he convinced himself it had been an animal. Maybe a fox, maybe wind across the ridge. But when news of the missing couple spread, he called it in. Rangers noted it, but the problem was geography. Upper Pine Lake was well outside the couple's projected range. To get there, they'd have had to veer off the main loop early, through heavy brush and with no clear trail. The area had already been searched lightly by air, with no results. Still, Holloway's account was chilling enough that a ground team hiked in again, but found nothing. No tracks, no broken branches, no campfire remnants. Just silence. The same day, a camper named Elena Vargas came forward with something stranger. She had been hiking a lesser-used access trail near the southern base of the range, called the Mott Gulch Path. While taking a break just after noon on Sunday, she spotted a granola bar, unopened, clean, lying on a flat rock. At first, she assumed someone had dropped it, but what stuck with her was how neatly it had been placed, almost like someone left it intentionally. She took a photo before moving on. When she later heard about the missing hikers, she uploaded the photo to a forum where amateur searchers had been collecting data. It showed a common energy bar brand, one Elliot and Marissa were known to use. Rangers were notified and sent a team to the site, but it yielded no further clues. No other trash, no footprints, no gear. With each of these sightings or anomalies, hope briefly flickered, only to be extinguished again by the lack of follow-up evidence. There was nothing cohesive, no timeline that made sense, no direction that pointed to a logical deviation from the trail. Investigators began quietly documenting these accounts not as leads, but as noise. In cold cases, it's common. People want to help, but memory is faulty. Geography is misjudged. Coincidence blurs into meaning. Still, there were enough of these strange moments to give the families pause. Something about them felt just real enough. Behind closed doors, rangers began revisiting their most likely scenario: accidental death, hidden by terrain. It was a difficult thing to tell grieving families, but by day 11, that's what they were preparing to do. The Beartooth Mountains were shaped by thousands of years of ice, wind, and erosion. Snowmelt slides were fast, silent, and devastating. They could sweep someone into a ravine and bury them beneath 10 feet of rock and runoff. Or, worse, a crevasse, narrow invisible slits in the glacial floor that closed after a fall. Rangers explained this in person, gently but firmly. Elliot and Marissa had likely slipped, fallen, and been taken somewhere that search efforts couldn't reach. It wasn't what the families wanted to hear, but it was the cleanest theory the park could offer. Still, not everyone accepted that. Marissa's sister, Amanda, pushed back immediately. She started drawing connections between the Scream report and the granola bar. She printed satellite maps and traced alternate paths, posting them on online forums. She contacted hiking YouTubers and survival podcasts, trying to draw attention. She wrote to missing persons investigators, claiming the park had failed to follow up on known side trails. To her, the inconsistencies didn't cancel each other out, they built a pattern. But without new evidence, the search couldn't continue. The park's budget was exhausted, the terrain had been covered, and statistically, after 10 days in the backcountry without food or fire, survival was unlikely. What remained was a silence that didn't make sense. If they'd gotten lost, why no trail markers? If they'd fallen, why no dropped gear? If they'd encountered someone else, how had it happened so cleanly? Families of missing persons often say they just want something, anything, a boot print, a jacket, a piece of torn fabric, something to anchor grief to. But Elliot and Marissa left none of that behind. Just a photo, a trailhead log, and 1,000 square miles of unforgiving mountain wilderness. And still, one question kept returning. If nature had taken them, why hadn't it left a trace? As the weeks turned into months, the momentum surrounding Elliot and Marissa's disappearance faded. Media coverage slowed, headlines gave way to newer stories, and the world moved on, except for the families. Marissa's sister Amanda couldn't let it go. She refused to accept the park's explanation that they'd likely fallen into a crevasse or been swept away unseen. Something deeper gnawed at her, the complete lack of evidence, the absence of gear, the dead-end clues, the way it had all just stopped. She quit her part-time job, pored over maps, joined hiking forums, and began reaching out to anyone who had hiked Glacier Trail that summer. She wasn't looking for sympathy. She was looking for something the search teams had missed. By late 2010, Amanda had launched a website dedicated to the case. She titled it Where the Trail Ended. She uploaded timelines, mapped sighting reports, even tracked snowfall patterns from that July. Users began trickling in, some hikers, some sleuths, some just drawn by the strange silence at the core of the story. And as the online discussion grew, so did the theories. Some claimed the couple had stumbled onto something they weren't supposed to see, a drug operation, a backwoods cult, a fugitive hideout. Others insisted it had to be something natural but extraordinary, like a sudden collapse into a volcanic fissure or a hidden cavern network under the ridge. More extreme posts claimed government involvement or cloaked disappearances tied to a long history of strange vanishings in the Beartooth Mountains. Amanda didn't endorse the wildest ones, but she also didn't shut them down. To her, anything was better than silence. In one of her blog entries, Amanda detailed how she had personally retraced parts of the trail that fall with a small group of volunteers. They found nothing new, just familiar ridgelines, melted streams, and endless pine. But in the process, she met someone who'd quietly kept something to himself. His name was Rick Nolan, a local hiker in his 60s, known around Cook City as a bit of a loner. He told Amanda that during the July weekend Elliot and Marissa went missing, he'd passed them around mid-morning near the Ridgepoint Junction. According to Rick, they'd asked him about an old trail he used to talk about, something called the Ridge Passage, an off-map path that once served as a ranger shortcut before being closed in the late 80s due to rock instability. Rick claimed he'd casually mentioned it, warned it was dangerous, then moved on. He said they seemed experienced enough to know better than to try it. Amanda brought this story to the Park Service, but by then, it had been months, and no one could verify Rick's account. His statement wasn't on record, and he admitted he hadn't come forward during the initial investigation, saying he hadn't wanted the attention. Rangers reviewed his description and concluded that if Elliot and Marissa had gone that way, they would have needed to bushwhack off the main trail and climb a steep, unmaintained slope. Given the terrain and weather conditions, it seemed unlikely. There were no other witnesses, no gear found near the passage, and no clear reason for the couple to attempt it. The park quietly dismissed it as speculative, perhaps even a misremembered detail, another fragment in a case already cluttered with noise. But Amanda never let go of the Ridge Passage. To her, it explained what nothing else could: the sudden disappearance, the lack of a trail, the failure of search efforts. It was a dangerous detour with no cell signal and no signage. If they'd tried it, slipped, or been caught in a storm, no one would have thought to look there. She added it to the site, mapped its location as best she could, and began encouraging experienced hikers to explore the region on their own. A few did, some sending back video footage of steep drop-offs, landslides, and overgrown switchbacks that hadn't seen human traffic in decades. One clip showed the rusted remains of a wooden post, maybe a trail marker, poking from a snowbank. Still, no sign of Elliot or Marissa. By 2012, the forums had fractured into factions. Some believed Amanda had gone too far, chasing theories that made no practical sense. Others rallied behind her, praising her refusal to accept the official line. Meanwhile, the families continued their quiet rituals, birthday vigils, anniversary hikes, and empty holiday tables. What lingered most wasn't just the grief. It was the absence of narrative. No one knew what happened. There was no story to tell, no final act to settle on. Just a gap where two lives had been. Then, in 2015, a new summer rolled in. And for the first time in years, the mountains gave something back. Something that would pull the case and the forgotten trail back into focus. It wasn't a ranger or a search team that found the first real clue. It was a volunteer. In July of 2015, 5 years after Elliot and Marissa disappeared, a retired schoolteacher named Tom Hanley was working with a conservation group helping to clear seasonal debris along the Larkspur Cutoff Trail. It was a rarely used route, mainly accessed by locals, and one that had never been part of the official Glacier Trail system. As he cleared a tangle of downed branches along a ravine edge, he spotted what looked like part of a glove, wedged between two rocks, sun-bleached and stiff with age. He pocketed it without much thought, assuming it had been there for years. But that evening, back at camp, he noticed something faintly stitched into the wristband. 2 initials, E and W. He didn't know what they meant, but his niece did. She'd followed Amanda Dale's blog for years and knew those letters had been mentioned before. Elliot Warren, the missing hiker. Tom sent the glove to the park office the following morning. Rangers took it seriously. Weathered as it was, the initials matched. The glove was a known brand Elliot used. They sent it for forensic testing. A month later, DNA analysis confirmed what no one had expected after half a decade. The glove had belonged to Elliot. It was the first confirmed physical trace of either hiker since they vanished. Suddenly, a case that had felt long and cold stirred again. Rangers contacted both families. The site was marked. A new search operation was quickly assembled, but what caught everyone off guard wasn't just that something had been found. It was where. The glove had been recovered more than 12 miles southeast of Ridgepoint Summit, and at least 7 miles off the main glacier loop. Even accounting for a wrong turn or panic detour, the location made no sense. To reach it, Elliot would have had to traverse unstable terrain, descend through overgrown drainage, and push through thick forest with no known trails. It wasn't just remote, it was geographically inconsistent with every search theory they'd had up to that point. Rangers double-checked the original hiking plan, confirmed GPS dead zones, and compared timestamps from the last known photo. There was no logical route that led from Ridgepoint to where the glove had been found, not in 2 days, not with Marissa, and certainly not without gear. Amanda wasn't surprised. To her, it aligned with the Ridge Passage theory. She believed they'd taken the unofficial route, gotten lost, and kept pushing downhill looking for a way out. But Rangers weren't convinced. The elevation profile didn't support that theory. If they had descended from the Ridge Passage, they should have emerged miles west of where the glove appeared. The discovery reignited debate, but it didn't bring clarity. If anything, it deepened the puzzle. Why was only one glove found? Where was the second? Why no bones, no backpack, no clothing scraps? If Elliot had made it that far, why leave behind the one item with his initials? And most pressing, was he alive when he reached that ravine? Search teams combed the surrounding area for days, ground units with cadaver dogs, drones with infrared, volunteers sweeping brush on hands and knees. Nothing surfaced, no signs of campfires, no dropped tools, no disturbed soil. Even the glove's condition was strange. It showed signs of UV exposure, some tearing, but no significant weathering from wildlife. It was as if it had been placed, or had tumbled down from somewhere higher up. But above the ravine was just more rock. No path, no recent landslides, just cliffs. With no new evidence, the search was suspended again. But the families, especially Amanda, felt something had changed. This wasn't speculation. It wasn't a theory. It was proof that at least one of them had made it far, beyond the original search radius. The media briefly picked up the story again. Headlines like, "Glove reopens 5-year mystery" circulated, and for a few weeks there was hope that more might follow. Tips came in. Most were dead ends. A few were downright cruel. But one, buried in a string of old blog comments, stood out. A user, anonymous, no profile, claimed to have seen 2 hikers near the Larkspur Ravine the same weekend the couple vanished. They said the pair looked exhausted, were moving slowly, and had asked for directions but were headed the wrong way. The comment had been posted in 2011 and forgotten. Now, in light of the glove, Amanda reread it differently. She sent it to rangers, but the trail was too cold to follow. The user's account was deleted, no IP data available. Still, it planted a seed. What if someone had seen them and didn't realize what they were witnessing? As summer turned to fall, the discovery of the glove remained the only piece of Elliot ever found. It raised more questions than it answered. It stretched the map, reshaped the theory, and reignited the ache in both families. Because now they weren't just missing. Now they had been somewhere else. Alive, perhaps. Lost, almost certainly. But if Elliot had made it that far, what had stopped him? And where, in that vast silence, had Marissa gone? By the summer of 2020, a full decade had passed since Elliot Warren and Marissa Dale vanished on Glacier Trail. In that time, the mountains had changed. The snowpack receded, old trees fell, new brush took their place. But the case had remained exactly where it left off. Stalled. Unanswered. Known now by park officials as Incident 1047, it was quietly understood among staff to be one of the strangest disappearances in the history of the Beartooth region. Not because of what was found, but because of what wasn't. No remains, no gear, no consistent witness accounts. Only a single glove, found 5 years in, miles away from the search zone. In a place no one could explain. That July, on the 10th anniversary, both families returned to Montana. They held a small memorial at the Ridgepoint trailhead. There were no speeches, no press, just a shared moment of silence, marked by the passing of time and the echo of what still hadn't surfaced. Amanda, now in her 30s, organized a community hike along the first 3 miles of the couple's intended route. She didn't speak much to reporters, but in an interview later that week she said, "We're not here to find closure. We're here to remind the mountain they were here." In the years following the glove's discovery, Amanda had continued pressing for more advanced search efforts. She lobbied the park to bring in cadaver dogs trained for deep scent detection, capable of locating remains buried under rock or snow. She pushed for thermal drone surveys when summer melt exposed new terrain. Most of those requests were denied or delayed. The case, officially inactive, didn't meet the criteria for funding. Still, she kept pushing. A few times, she got small teams in on special permits, but the land was too vast, too broken. There were no landmarks, no signs, just miles of silence. Behind the scenes, though, something else had begun to shift. Rangers and investigators who had worked the case early on, many now retired or transferred, had left behind notes, theories, and internal memos. One of them, a former field supervisor who agreed to speak anonymously, revealed that by year 3, a quiet theory had circulated within the department. It suggested that Elliot and Marissa may have never gone missing where everyone thought they had, that they hadn't followed the route laid out in their trip plan, that they'd deliberately changed course. But to admit that publicly would mean challenging the only documented proof they had, the trailhead log, the time-stamped photo, the map in their car. According to the former ranger, some believed the couple had intended to explore the old ridge passage all along, that the notes left behind were a decoy, maybe even a safety net. If something went wrong, they wouldn't be blamed for going off-grid. But that theory required intent, secrecy. And nothing in Elliot or Marissa's history supported it. Their gear was meticulously labeled. Their digital footprint was consistent with experienced, rule-abiding hikers. They had no history of risk-taking for its own sake. And still, the terrain didn't lie. If the glove had made it 12 miles from Ridgepoint, something about their intended plan didn't add up. When the theory was quietly floated to the families, it sparked immediate tension. Elliot's parents dismissed it as a stretch, an attempt to assign blame instead of accepting that the mountain had swallowed their son. Marissa's mother was more hesitant, admitting she'd always found the official narrative too neat, but even she couldn't bring herself to believe her daughter would mislead them. Amanda, for her part, didn't rule it out. She believed they may have discovered something during the hike, something that pulled them off course. But she never accepted the idea that it had been planned. To her, the tragedy was rooted in curiosity, not deception. In 2020, the Park Service quietly archived the case file, not closed but sealed as inactive. Internal memos noted that without new evidence, no further searches would be sanctioned. The families were notified, though Amanda had already expected it. By that point, she was already working with a pair of independent geospatial analysts, people she'd met through her online network, trying to model terrain flow using 3D maps and historical snowmelt data. It was a long shot, but it gave her purpose. And in cold cases, sometimes that's the only thing that keeps people moving. What lingered now wasn't just grief. It was uncertain. And that's what made the case feel so cold. Not the temperature. Not the time passed, but the lack of closure in any form. Not a trail, not a witness, not even a theory that stuck. Just a glove on a rock and a growing sense that whatever happened out there had slipped permanently out of reach. But then, almost exactly 15 years to the day since they were last seen, something began to change. The hottest summer on record swept across the west. Glaciers began to melt at an unprecedented rate, and in a pocket of the mountain long sealed by time and ice, a secret was slowly starting to thaw. In August of 2025, the northern edge of the Beartooth Shelf looked different than anyone had seen it in decades. Following what would be declared the hottest summer in recorded state history, the glacial mass that had once capped the high basin above Ridgepoint had receded further than models had predicted. Ice that had stood unmoved for over 40 years was now collapsing in slabs, giving way to exposed rock, runoff streams, and debris fields long buried beneath snowpack. Park rangers noticed the changes during routine flyovers, boulders and terrain they didn't recognize, erosion lines cutting new channels across the basin's face. It was the kind of shift that geologists study with slow reverence, but to one team on the ground, it was a doorway into something unexpected. A university research group from Bozeman had been granted a seasonal permit to collect sediment core samples along the glacier's edge. Their work was slow, technical, sampling meltwater, mapping retreat lines. On the morning of August 14th, a graduate assistant named Jesse Lowry noticed something glinting under a collapsed sheet of ice. At first he assumed it was more metallic silt, a natural artifact from mineral friction, but as he brushed away the slush, he saw a corroded rod bent at an odd angle, bolted to what appeared to be fabric, torn and partially fused into the ice. A closer look revealed a collapsed structure, triangular in frame, roughly 8 feet across. A tent, or what was left of one. The team halted their work. Photos were taken, coordinates logged, park officials were contacted within the hour. By afternoon, the area had been cordoned off. Rangers arrived first, then forensic investigators. What they found, once the ice was carefully chipped back and thawed under thermal blankets, was even more unsettling. Inside the collapsed frame were the remains of 2 sleeping bags, sealed shut by compression and time. One was partially torn, the other largely intact. Both were fused to the icy soil, but visible inside each were traces of human remains, clothing fibers, fragments of hair, skeletal structure collapsed inward. The location was far above the known hiking paths, near the upper slope of the Old Ridge Passage, an area never searched, never even suspected. The coroner's office from Carbon County was dispatched to the scene. Standard procedure required remains to be evaluated in place before movement. That Night, under tented cover, forensic techs began the long process of thawing and cataloging the site. Based on initial observations, the scene had not been disturbed. The tent frame had collapsed inward rather than from an external force. There were no signs of trauma, no blood patterning, just decay and pressure. A waterproof backpack, partially buried in sediment, was recovered nearby. Inside was a journal, sealed in a plastic sleeve, warped by time but intact. By morning, dental records provided the confirmation no one was prepared for. The remains belonged to Elliot Warren and Marissa Dale. 15 years after they disappeared without a trace, they had finally been found, not by a search team, not by dog patrols or aerial scans, but by ice surrendering its hold. The revelation was immediate and seismic. Amanda was notified first. She flew in within 24 hours. When she arrived at the ranger station and was shown the evidence, she didn't cry, according to one official. She just stared at the site map for a long time and said quietly, "So they made it that far." News of the discovery broke slowly as officials prepared a public statement. The recovery effort lasted 3 days. The ground was unstable, and conditions above the site were still shifting due to melt runoff. Still, the scene was handled with care. Forensic pathologists took samples. Every piece of debris was logged. The tent fabric, traced to a model released in 2009, matched a missing item from Elliot's gear checklist. The sleeping bags were tagged in Marissa's hiking inventory. There was no doubt. It was them. What still remained unknown was how they ended up there. The elevation of the site was nearly 800 feet higher than their intended route. The incline was steep, unstable, and largely undocumented. The only nearby landmark was a faded game trail, likely used by wildlife during low snow seasons. No rational map would have led them there. And yet, they had made it, set up camp, together, in a remote hollow above the old ridge corridor. Why they stopped there, or what kept them from continuing, remained unclear. What struck investigators most was the preservation. 15 years in sub-zero conditions had slowed decay, leaving the scene strangely intact. It wasn't a crime scene. It wasn't violent. It was a moment frozen, two people trying to shelter, maybe rest, maybe wait out something they thought would pass. But time didn't pass the way they needed it to. And when the cold came, it didn't leave. The final item logged from the scene was the journal, pages warped but readable. The last entry, dated July 18, 2010, simply read, "Too steep to go back. The weather is turning. Hoping for sun tomorrow." Below it, a line scratched hastily in a different ink. "Still together." That final detail would remain sealed in Amanda's memory long after the press cycle faded. Because now there was no more theory, no more formed debates. They hadn't disappeared without a trace. The mountain had simply held them longer than anyone expected. But as it let go, it told a story no one could have written, and one that still had more to reveal. The formal identification came just after sunrise. Dental records matched. One set belonged to Elliot Warren, the other to Marissa Dale. Both sets of remains had been found side by side inside their respective sleeping bags, partially preserved by glacial ice. No evidence of trauma, no broken bones, just the quiet stillness of long-expired life sealed beneath the surface for 15 years. Park officials informed the families first, then released a short public statement confirming what had long been feared. The couple had not survived. But the discovery did more than close a case. It opened a new one, because with the remains, inside a weather-warped backpack buried beneath sediment and meltwater, was a journal. The journal was spiral-bound, waterproof, and belonged to Elliot. It had been sealed in a clear zippered sleeve, and despite years under the ice, much of the ink had survived. The entries weren't long, just field notes, jotted in shorthand and date-marked. They painted a portrait of two people slowly coming to terms with the fact that something had gone very wrong. The first dated entry was from July 16th, a day after they began their hike. It described good weather, light wind, and a stop at Ridgepoint Summit for photos. Nothing unusual. But the following day, the tone changed. An entry marked July 17th, noted the discovery of what Elliot described as an unmarked ridge path that, according to his estimation, cuts 2 hours off the loop. He had hiked part of it before, he wrote, and believed it connected back down into the forested basin below the trailhead. Marissa was hesitant, but he'd convinced her it was worth a shot. That decision changed everything. The next entry, scrawled in slanted, rushed handwriting, was dated the evening of the 17th. It mentioned losing visibility, an unexpected fog bank, and terrain that didn't match Elliot's memory. They'd descended too far and then attempted to climb back up, only to be met with loose rock and failing daylight. The entry closed with a note that they had found a safe spot to pitch and would reevaluate in the morning. The final full entry, dated July 18th, detailed their attempt to backtrack up the ridge, which failed. The path had eroded. What had looked passable from above turned out to be too steep and too loose. The snow began falling shortly after noon. Supplies were low. Water was limited to runoff. Elliot noted they still had 2 thermal blankets, but morale was dipping. The final line in that entry read, "We think it's best to stay put and wait for it to pass." There was one more page. A single sentence, unlined, written in shakier handwriting, likely hours or even days later. "We can't go back the way we came." No signature, no closing. Just those words, followed by a blank remainder of the notebook. That line was more than a detail. It was a verdict. For all their preparation, their experience, their planning, they had ended up in a place they couldn't leave. The unmarked trail they'd hoped would be a shortcut had led them instead to a geological dead end. And with no way down, no visibility, and dwindling options, they had done what experienced hikers are trained to do. They stayed put. They waited. But no one ever came. For the families, the journal was devastating but clarifying. It gave shape to the silence they'd lived with for so long. Elliot's parents read the final entries in private, then chose not to share them publicly. Marissa's mother asked to keep a photocopy of the last page. Amanda, who had spent years mapping the very ridge Elliot described, felt hollow. She had always believed they'd taken the ridge passage, but seeing it in his own words was different. It wasn't a theory anymore. It was history, and it was written in ink. For investigators, the journal answered one question while raising several others. It confirmed the couple had left the main trail by choice and had believed, however briefly, that they could make it back safely. But it still didn't explain why they never activated their emergency beacon. If it had malfunctioned or been left behind or lost during the descent, no one could say. The beacon was never recovered, nor did it explain how the glove Elliot had dropped ended up miles from where their remains were found. It was a clue still suspended in the timeline, an unanswered thread that didn't quite fit the rest of the narrative. The journal was submitted into evidence and archived. A scanned copy was given to the families. Amanda later uploaded a redacted version to the website she'd maintained for over a decade, along with a short message. "They were closer than we thought. But the mountain was closer too." And while the remains had been found, and the journal had filled in many of the gaps, the next phase of recovery would come not from maps or notes, but from what else the glacier might still be hiding. Because 2 people had died in that hollow, but not everything recovered from the ice belonged to them. The path described in Elliot's journal had never appeared on any modern hiking maps, but after the remains were recovered and the entries studied, a team of veteran rangers hiked out with archival materials from decades past, old ranger route charts, fire patrol overlays, and handwritten notations from the 1970s. What they found matched almost exactly. The narrow stretch Elliot had referred to as a ridge shortcut had once been a ranger supply line, used sparingly in the early days of park patrols to shuttle equipment between 2 remote cabins. Officially, it had been closed in 1987 after a rockslide made it impassable. The path had never been maintained after that. Over time, it vanished beneath vegetation and snowpack, eventually removed from public maps entirely. On paper, it didn't exist. But on foot, if you knew what to look for, parts of it were still there. That realization deepened the mystery, Because even if Elliot had once read about the trail, even if he'd studied historic topography in school, actually locating the entrance would have been nearly impossible. The access point sat along a steep and unmarked outcrop just beyond Ridge Point summit, technically outside the visible trail zone. To reach it, a hiker would need to make a sharp, unnatural uphill detour, cutting away from the main loop and scrambling up loose rock. One veteran ranger speculated that a fallen tree or weathered washout may have briefly exposed a sliver of the old trail, just enough to make it look like a viable route. Another suggested Elliot might have seen a wildlife track and misidentified it, not realizing what it truly was until they were already committed. Either way, the decision led them away from visibility, off the map, and into one of the least accessible zones in the entire Beartooth Range. The final location where the couple was found lay in a steep basin surrounded on three sides by unstable cliffs. To the south, a sheer drop of nearly 150 feet. To the west, jagged outcrops and eroded ledges. The only exit would have required climbing back up the way they came, an impossibility given the erosion, snowfall, and lack of technical gear. Investigators determined that once Elliot and Marissa realized their mistake, they had attempted to ascend, failed, and decided to shelter in place. That much was evident from the way the tent was pitched, in the only flat hollow they could find, tucked against the rock face. But what haunted everyone who examined the scene was the quiet realization that they'd survived for at least 2 days in that spot. They weren't swept away. They weren't killed in a fall. They'd been alive, waiting, in a place where no one was looking. Amanda visited the site under escort a week after the discovery. She was shown the ridge, the hollow, the incline they would have climbed. In an interview afterward, she said she didn't understand how Elliot had believed it was a good idea. He wasn't reckless, she said. He studied routes like blueprints, so either he knew something the rest of us didn't, or he really thought they could shave hours off and beat the weather. Rangers couldn't answer that. What they did know was that once the storm rolled in, the narrow basin had likely filled with fog and snow so thick it erased all reference points. A thermal drone flyover of the same area, conducted a year earlier, had failed to register anything due to canopy interference and heat scatter. Even today, the terrain was considered nearly invisible from the air under certain conditions. The location's remoteness only underscored the tragedy. It explained why dogs hadn't picked up a scent, why volunteers never got close, why the glove, found far downhill, had been the only trace for years. Forensic analysts suggested it may have been carried by runoff, wind, or even an animal. But without more of their belongings found, the trail remained fragmented. No camera, no GPS unit, no emergency beacon, just a tent, 2 bags, a journal, and silence. The park issued an internal update to its staff, reclassifying the ridge area as off-limits, not due to danger, but out of respect. It was now considered a site of historical significance, not open to hikers, with no plans for trail development or signage. The official case summary was updated and released to the public, closing the missing persons file with a final determination: accidental death by environmental exposure. But unofficially, among rangers, the phrase repeated most often was, an impossible route. Not because it didn't exist, but because it never should have led them there. Even as the facts lined up, route, timing, terrain, one question still pressed at the edges of closure. Why did they go that way? Why leave the mapped loop at all? The journal didn't say. There was no mention of a reason beyond saving time. No note of distress, no outside pressure, no obvious mistake. Just 2 experienced hikers, 1 wrong turn, and a mountain that, for 15 years, kept its secret beneath the ice. And even now, as the glacier continued to recede, revealing what had been hidden for so long, not everything found belonged to them. One more discovery was still coming, one that would shake what little peace had finally settled. 3 weeks after Elliot and Marissa's remains were recovered, the heat didn't let up. Day after day, the temperatures across the Beartooth Range hovered above seasonal norms. Glacial runoff surged through channels long dried up. In satellite imagery, what once looked like solid white began showing streaks of gray and brown as sediment bled through the melting surface. Rangers remained in the area, not just for documentation, but because of one rule they all understood after cases like this. When ice lets go, it rarely releases just one thing. On August 30th, a ranger on a routine sweep of the basin's lower perimeter noticed something strange. Flat stones arranged in a near-perfect rectangle. At the center was a crumpled thermal blanket. It had been weighed down deliberately, held in place by fist-sized rocks, some of them blackened, as if scorched. Forensics were called back in. The rocks were carefully removed. Beneath the blanket was a shallow depression in the earth, no deeper than 6 inches. Within it lay a partial set of human remains, scorched, fragmentary, and severely degraded. Charred bone, ash traces, melted synthetic fabric, and beside it, something small and partially buried in the silt, a camera. Melted beyond repair, lens fused to casing, battery blistered. What appeared to be an SD card had fractured into several pieces. The entire site was isolated for recovery. Everything about it was inconsistent with what had already been found. The thermal blanket didn't match the couple's gear inventory. Neither did the material found with the bones. And most notably, the condition of the remains, burned and exposed, was drastically different from the preservation inside the ice only 40 yards away. Forensics confirmed within days what rangers had begun to suspect. The remains did not belong to Elliot or Marissa. The bones, fewer than 30% of a full skeleton, were from a third individual. No clothing tags, no ID, no dental records immediately matched. Carbon scoring on several fragments suggested a fire had been set intentionally, though whether for warmth, signal, or something else couldn't be determined. What puzzled investigators most was the way the blanket had been placed, neatly, methodically. Whoever had arranged it either cared about the remains or feared them being found. Either way, someone had been here after the tent was set up, and that someone wasn't supposed to be. The discovery reframed everything. If a third person had been present, who were they? Were they with Elliot and Marissa when they got lost, or did they come later? There was nothing in the journal entries to suggest another individual. No mention of an encounter, no final note, just silence. Park records showed no missing persons reports in that immediate region during the same time window. But a sweep through the national database turned up a few long-term unsolved cases: transients, seasonal workers, off-grid hikers. One in particular stood out, a 34-year-old man named Cody Wren, reported missing in 2009 while hiking alone near the Wind River Range, about 70 miles south. He'd been presumed dead after vanishing without a trace, but he'd also owned a model of camera similar to the one found near the burned remains. The SD card fragments were sent to a specialized lab in Oregon. Recovery would take weeks, maybe longer. Heat damage, moisture, and degradation had left much of the data unreadable. The hope was that partial image recovery could at least reveal faces, terrain, timestamps, anything to confirm who had last handled the camera. But the results were inconclusive. Only 3 files could be partially reconstructed. One showed what looked like a tree line at dusk. Another, a blurry figure walking ahead on a trail. The third was unreadable, just blocks of pixelated gray. None of them showed faces clearly. None of them confirmed location. No metadata survived, just fragments of something no one could yet explain. Amanda was called back in for consultation. She examined the camera and gear catalog but confirmed it wasn't theirs. The fire starting method, the scorched rocks and layering, also didn't match Elliot's habits. He preferred gas stoves and wrote openly about fire risks in backcountry zones. Investigators considered other theories. Could the couple have stumbled upon someone already, out there? Someone injured or dying? Could the fire have been an attempt to cremate, or was it survival? But the timing didn't add up. Elliot and Marissa's tent had been pitched in a way that suggested they were waiting out bad weather, not hiding. The third site didn't align with that. It felt different, more urgent, more final. Eventually, the new discovery was entered into the case file under a separate reference number. The original case, Elliot and Marissa's disappearance, was now considered resolved, cause of death, environmental exposure. But this second individual remained unidentified. and what they were doing in that same narrow basin remained unknown. Whether they were with the couple, or arrived separately, or had been there long before, the ice hadn't given up that part of the story. Not yet. Even now the glacier continues to melt. Each year reveals more of what time has buried, but the answers come slowly, incomplete, and often too late. In the hollow where two hikers once waited for the sun to return, the earth has begun speaking again. But not everything it says makes sense, and not everything it reveals belongs to the people we lost.